There have been a lot of theories flying around on just what happened in the midterms that led to such unexpected results, with a big anticipated Republican sweep failing to materialize. Some argue former President Donald Trump's involvement did more harm than good for the Republicans he backed. Others point to the increased political extremism and threats to rights like access to abortion that pushed people to the polls. But another major factor, youth voters. 27% of young people in this country turned out to vote in this year's midterms. That's the second highest youth voter rate in the past 30 years. And overwhelmingly, they voted blue. 62% in House races. And in some areas, that number was even higher. So what does this tell us about the future of politics in the U.S.? To discuss, I'm joined by Ashley Clark. She's a junior at Northeastern University and one of the national political directors of Voters of Tomorrow. And Kei Kawashima-Ginsberg, Newhouse director at the Center for Information and Research on Civil Learning and Engagement at Tufts. Thank you both for joining us. I'll start with you, Kei. This election was supposed to be the big red wave and now being described as more of a ripple. And a lot of that's being attributed to youth involvement. Tell us, what part of the story was the youth vote?
Young people were a really big part of the voting in many states and nationally too. Part of the story that we are hearing and seeing in the data is really young people made their opinions clear, especially when it comes to state level decisions around abortion rights and access to reproductive rights. And young people who may not have thought of voting in midterms seem to come out in a larger number and decidedly chose a Democratic candidate, particularly in House and Senate and governor races. And those views have been really consistent among young people, starting around 2018 midterm election, where young people broke their own voting record then too. That time it was gun violence movement. This time it's abortion. And young people really committed to engaging each other, talking to their friends and their cousins and families to make sure that everybody they know about the issue and then come out to make their informed choices. So we're really glad to see this.
So Ashley, your organization is part of building up that voter base, getting people to the polls. Take us a little bit inside the process that led up to this election. What was mobilization like?
Yeah, most definitely. So Voters of Tomorrow, we are a national Gen Z-led grassroots organization working to engage, represent, and empower our generation in politics and government. And with that, we have had 20 different state chapters across the nation turning out young voters in key districts that we know could determine the midterm election. So that was calling thousands of young voters in these districts. We sent over 5 million texts this election cycle to young voters and just telling them that their vote and their voice matters when it comes to the key decisions in our government.
Do you have a sense of what issues were key, Ashley? What really was driving people to actually follow through?
Yeah, absolutely. So as stated before, we have seen that abortion was a top issue for young voters, along with the economy, with student loan forgiveness. That has been a very big issue. Also regarding gun violence and gun violence protection, we've seen the far right constantly, attack and attack our rights to be able to go to school without fearing being shot. And so those are the types of issues that we've seen Gen Z really turn out for: abortion, gun violence protection, and the economy.
So Gen Z really has been voting Democratic. Is your organization, it has a whole list of initiatives and goals, kind of like a wish list for government, which is a very Democratic agenda. Do you open up to Republican voters? Is it about a party? How do you describe it?
Yeah, so Voters of Tomorrow, we have launched what we consider to be our Gen Z agenda, meaning all of the issues that we regard Gen Z voting for, seeing those as the top issues, like I said before: gun violence prevention, ensuring that we have access to higher education. But through our mobilization efforts, we do not focus on targeting a certain party because, our democracy is better when we all vote. So that doesn't mean turning out young Democrats, young Republicans. That means every single young individual between 18 to 29 and outside of that should have their right to vote, and us having the mobilization efforts to give them those tools to have their voices heard has been a really great opportunity, and we had just very, very great success this midterm election.
So, Kei, tell us what races were the ones where youth was really key to making a change?
So there are some states where statewide races like Michigan governor, Pennsylvania Senate, Wisconsin governor, of course, Georgia Senate, and Arizona governor. Those are some of the places where we're already naming before the election. Based on the data that's already available, young people were likely to be really pivotal, and it's turning out to be true. There are a couple of things to say about that. One is that the young people tend to make very different as a group choice as to who they prefer as a candidate. In those races that we just named, they happen to prefer a Democratic candidate by a large margin, when other age groups tend to prefer the Republican candidate, often by a large margin.
Yeah, we have one example in Pennsylvania. We can put up the numbers. Voters in Pennsylvania supporting Fetterman when compared by age group, ages 18 to 29. It was 70% of that group compared to 55% of the 30 to 44 group. So what was really driving voters? Ashley, do you have a sense of what was driving voters in Pennsylvania?
I think that in Pennsylvania specifically, we had two very different candidates. One was a pro-democracy candidate, John Fetterman, against Dr. Oz, who was saying, he would be fighting for taking away a woman's right to choose, that, the right to an abortion was between a woman, her doctor, and local politicians. And Gen Z doesn't want that. And that was seen in Pennsylvania, where 70% of those young voters did turn out for John Fetterman to reject that far right notion of Dr. Oz. So I definitely think that all of those kind of played into an effect of why John Fetterman prevailed on Tuesday.
But Kei, the group Gen Z, which maybe we should remind people who don't necessarily know, that's between the age of 10 and 25 or 8 and 23, depending on how you calculate it. But it's not a monolithic group. How do you explain really what the spectrum is?
They're both really diverse in terms of demographics. It's, about even the youngest group of this Gen Z voters, 46% of them are people of color, the ones that turned 18 after 2020 election. And a really large but significant minority of young people also identify with the LGBTQ community. So it's really diverse in that way. And they have different opinions coming through because of their diverse lived experiences. But ideologically, too, they are really leaning Democratic in terms of voting. But vast majority of them, about 60%, consider themselves as progressive, but not Democrats, interestingly. So only about a third of young people today say they're actually Democrats. And then about half of them are largely unaffiliated. They can lean either way, but they're not really bought into the idea of major party. I think Ashley may have something to say about that too, in that young people are really looking at candidates and what they can promise and what they can deliver. And that really derives how young people view specific candidates and, of course, how they come out to vote for a specific candidate.
So, Ashley, feel free to weigh in on that, but I really want to understand this idea that Gen Z are described as mistrustful of institutions, disillusioned with government. How would you describe what it is that motivates the voter? If you are disillusioned, what does it take to draw you in to say, I've got to dive in and help make a change, as opposed to apathy, I just can't change anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that over the past 2 years, we've seen extreme change with the voting bloc of Gen Z. And that's just because we've seen a lot more legislation delivered. Like, for example, we have seen gun control legislation passed in Congress. We have seen the largest investment in climate change, and the cancellation of student loan for debt, pardoning people for simple marijuana possession. These are all issues that Gen Z really does turn out for, and I think that we saw that on Tuesday. With the second highest rate of highest level of youth turnout since 2018. These are just issues that the Democrats and other people in power have been delivering on, and in return, Gen Z has delivered at the ballot box.
How much do you think things like the pandemic, social unrest, January 6th, climate climate change. There are a lot of things roiling in the past decade. How much does that really impact and motivate the Gen Z voter?
Yeah, I mean, we're a generation that's grown up through 9/11, the economic recession of 2008, COVID. And through all of this, our generation has prevailed and has said our voices need to be heard. And we have a voice that matters in these issues. And that is spanning from Washington, D.C., where we just elected the first Gen Z member of Congress, Maxwell Frost, in Florida's 10th district, to individuals in Gen Z who are now in the state legislatures in their states. So we, as a generation, have said enough is enough. We are here to have our voices heard, and we are fighting back against these issues that we've been growing up with our entire lives.
Kei, how much do you think the fact that Gen Z has grown up on social media really can't turn away from the news the way maybe earlier generations could? How much do you think that's factors into how involved they are?
I think hugely. So we are also seeing not only Gen Zs consume news and information, largely coming from friends and social media as a main source of information in many cases, but also they themselves making news or information for their friends and their micro community where they do have influence. And that's very different use of social media than what we used to see, which was the young people as consumer of information. Now they're creator of that information. Like Ashley's saying, they're turning out each other by informing them about that local race or that candidate that's running for state legislature to say, hey, there's somebody really exciting that we can impact. And I would also say that young people are not at all checked out of politics. If anything, our previous generations, my generation included, were more checked out. Their movements and their activism and organizing is really government engagement. They're directly calling out their state elected officials and national elected officials to say, you need to make better policies, you need to be accountable to us. And just because they're protesting, they don't mean that they're abandoning democracy. They're into it.
Thank you. Very, very quickly, Ashley, what is the plan for Georgia for the Warnock-Herschel-Walker runoff? Is there a specific plan there? Very quickly.
Very quickly, we at Voters of Tomorrow have already established the plans that we're going to be going down to Georgia, being on the ground and providing any help to young voters that we can to help to ensure that they are making their voices heard in this essential race for control of the Senate.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both very much. Ashley and Kei, thanks for explaining this to us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.